Hey guys, Ryan here at Signature Edits. Inside this video, we're talking about probably the most important technical component of photography, and that is understanding great light. Because honestly, I see a lot of photos, a lot of moments that could have been perfect, but were completely ruined just by having really subpar, crappy light. So once you understand how to get good light, what good light is, and how to use light to support the emotions of your photos, everything about your photography is going to improve. So you ready? Let's do it. Alright, so let's talk lighting. Hands down, the most effective way to improve your photos is to improve your lighting. Why? Because without light, you don't have a photo. You just have a black wall of darkness and shame and depression. So we're going to talk about 6 fundamental ways to shape light and use light on your subjects to really create flattering scenes and improve your photography.
So this is a spotlight. As you can see, it's very direct. It's not really hitting all of me, it's just hitting a specific area, and the rest of me is going to be left in shadow. Now the advantage of a spotlight, it's a hard light, it's very focused, which means it can throw the light a farther distance. However, not very flattering. But if I were to take some diffusion and put it in front of that spotlight, now you can see that light is getting broken up. It's going in many different directions, it's a little more flattering, and it's covering more of me. If we were to take even more diffusion, like a really large softbox or a very cloudy day, and put that in front of the light, it would get even softer. Now it's covering pretty much everything. There's going to be no shadows because all of me is getting covered in this nice, beautiful, soft light. So that's essentially what hard light and soft light are. It's the way that they interact with the scene because the light is going in many different directions. Now we can also adjust the angle of the light, and that's going to change the way the light is interacting with the scene as well. So for example, if the light is coming from up high, it's going to leave shadows underneath my nose, under my chin, it's going to define my face. But if the light is coming from down low, we're going to get that horror movie look. It's going to be coming up, there's going to be shadows under my cheekbones, around my eyes, you know the look. If we go to the left or to the right, that will adjust the way that the light is interacting with my face as well. We're going to shape my face better, we're going to maybe add some definition, hiding the cheekbones, all of that good stuff. The way that your light is interacting with the scene is going to shape the way that the subject appears. So, that's pretty much it when it comes to the way that the angle of the light and the hardness or the softness of the light interact with your subject. Okay.
So as I do this, we're going to talk about some technical terms, and I'm going to do that just to describe what I'm doing. But what I want you to focus on is less about the technical parts of this because it can get kind of confusing, memorizing a whole bunch of different photography terms. Focus more on the actual effect that the light is having as it's traveling across our model here. So we're going to run through these really quickly. Then we're going to break down the lighting setups of some popular movies and look at some professional photos, and we'll break down the lighting setups to create those same looks. Okay, so let's turn on our softbox here. And first off, we're going to talk about side lighting. So we're just going to take this light, put it at a 45-degree angle, and more or less 90 degrees to our subject. When we do that, we get split lighting, which is the one side of the face is lit, the other side of the face dark. Pretty easy, right? Now, as we take this light and we shift it over this way, we're going to get Rembrandt lighting. Now, Rembrandt lighting is named after a famous painter who painted all of his paintings with this specific lighting kind of situation affecting his scenes. And you see that we've got a nice shadow on the side of the face, but there's this illuminated triangle underneath the right eye here. That's Rembrandt lighting, when you have that triangle of light and the rest of the face is in darkness. So when we've got side lighting, we don't have a lot of shape to the face. We've got a light side and a dark side. So there's lots of contrast, lots of drama. But as we take our light over and create the Rembrandt lighting, we're actually illuminating the cheek, just the high part of the cheek, which is emphasizing the cheekbone and adding more shape to the face. So you're going to see a slenderer, is that a word? There's just more depth and more shape to the face than with our side lighting. As we take that light over a little bit further, now we have what is called loop lighting, which is a mixture between Rembrandt lighting and our very last lighting setup, which is butterfly lighting. So loop lighting is kind of a mixture of the two. And basically it's Rembrandt lighting, but a little bit less, a little bit more direct, and you're still going to get the definition around the face from those shadows from the nose and the cheek, but you're not going to have quite as much drama as with the Rembrandt lighting. So we're just doing this really quickly, then we're going to go and we'll actually look at some practical examples. So if this is going a little fast for you, don't worry, we're going to cover it again. Lastly, we have butterfly lighting, and this is kind of the most popular type of lighting when you're actually doing glamour shots because it's so flattering, especially on female faces. So it's above the subject and at about a 45-degree angle. And the reason it's called butterfly lighting is as our light is moved over the subject, you're going to see a shadow underneath the nose. And that shadow looks a little bit like a butterfly, hence the name. And the beauty of this particular light situation is we're going to be highlighting both cheeks, placing shadows underneath the cheeks, which emphasizes the cheekbone, makes the cheekbones appear to be higher than they are, and adds a lot of definition with a nice dark shadow underneath the chin. So if you want to add definition under the chin, emphasize the cheekbones, really slim down the nose by having a nice shadow on either side and a highlight right down the middle, that's what butterfly lighting is going to do for you. So pretty much every single scene that you see lit is going to be lit in one of these four ways. We've either got the side light, the Rembrandt light, the loop light, or butterfly light. And you can kind of play around with this if you happen to have a doll or just a friend who feels like sitting there for you for a while. You can take your light, you can move it around and see which you prefer and how it affects your subject. The easiest way to learn this, honestly, is just to actually take the light, practice it for yourself. And the cool part about doing it with a model like this, that's not a real person, is you can mess around for as long as you want, and you don't have to worry about the pressure of actually doing this on a shoot. You can figure this out in advance by yourself. So I'd highly recommend, as weird as it is, sitting down in this kind of a situation environment where there's no pressure and you can just practice. So we've got our side light, we've got our Rembrandt, we've got our loop light, and we've got our butterfly light. Now, another very popular way of lighting in Hollywood, if you look at action films, is to do a light on the side of the face and leave the front of the face in shadow. So I can't really do it so well here unless we incorporate one of our lighting modifiers. I've got a reflector here. So typically when you're actually doing lighting, you only really need one light. And that's because one light, pardon me, provides most of the light for your scene, and that's called the key light. Now, we use reflectors to reflect light from the key light. And as we do that, we can help place more light on the shadow side of the face. So right here, we've got a nice Rembrandt light happening. I can take this reflector and either help just bring a little bit more light to the side of the face, or I can actually take this light, put it in behind. Let's see if I can do this. Something like that. And you should be able to see we've got the face itself is in shadow, but we've got a highlight on both sides of the face just from behind. And that's a very common style of lighting in Hollywood movies as you watch them. So we've got our lighting setups. How else can we affect the light? Obviously, we can use modifiers to increase the amount of shadow or decrease the amount of shadow. You increase it by reflecting it with a white reflector. You can decrease it by flagging it with a black flag. And all that's going to do is just block out other ambient light in the scene. So I've got my light here, and if I want even more shadow on the side of the face, I just take my little flag here, and all of a sudden we've got more shadow because we're blocking any ambient light that may have been illuminating her from the side. Okay, so that's how we use modifiers. Those are our main lighting setups. I think at this point, we're pretty much ready to go ahead and launch over into our actual examples. So let's head over to the computer and look at some practical examples of real photography and break down the lighting setups being employed there. So now that we have some of the basics of lighting under our belt and we understand the difference between soft light and hard light and the difference that different angles can make for your lighting situation, let's take a look at some real life examples and how you can recreate these kinds of looks. So first off, we're going to start with some portrait studio examples because it's probably the easiest situation to figure out where the lights were set up because it's a really controlled environment and we have two things to illuminate where those lights were placed. The first is the shadows on our subject. When we look at our subject, we look at the shadows and see, okay, how dark are they? How strong are they in comparison to the light areas of the photo? Are they hard or are they really soft? Is the transition gradual? If that transition is gradual and the shadows aren't as dark, we know that there's a really soft light source employed. Now, on the other hand, if they're very dark, very hard shadows, then you know that you have a very directional light being used. The second thing we can look for is the catch light in the eye. So when we zoom in on our subject here, you can see this little bright area in the eye that's being reflected. That's a reflection of the light used in that shoot. So what's really cool is we can actually use these little catch lights and the shadows to figure out, okay, how would I set up a lighting situation like this to get this kind of an effect? So let's look at this photo to start with. Obviously, we've got a catch light in the top left corner. So we know that the light was placed somewhere around here. Now, if we look at the shadows and we zoom in, you can see there's a little bit of shadow here, shadow underneath, highlighting the cheekbone and placing some definition on the chin, a little bit of shadow down here and on the side. So we know that our light was nice and high. We've kind of got a mixture of a little bit of butterfly lighting / loop lighting going on here, and that's creating this particular look. We also know that the lighting situation was very, very flattering, a nice large source, and is very soft. We can tell that in two different ways. The first is that the shadows, not very obvious, they're very subtle. The second thing is that this catch light in the eye is very, very big. So obviously the bigger that light is, the bigger of a catch light it's going to create. So that's how you go about creating this kind of a look. You'd set the light up somewhere up and to the side of our subject. Make sure it's nice and big, so it's super flattering, and we shoot down. And if we need to, we can always add a reflector or a white piece of foam core, something like that, down here. And that will just help fill in this area. So we'll get some reflections coming off of this light and reflecting, filling in the shadows just a little bit. Looks like there probably wasn't a backlight used, and we can tell that by looking at the edge of the clothing. We would have a nice kind of glow going on if there's a backlight happening. I don't think there was. This looks like, to me, just a one light setup. So if you only have one light, this is a look you could achieve. Okay, this one, another black and white by Martin Kristnek. Really cool shot. And this is an example of clamshell lighting. Now that's one we didn't really talk about because clamshell lighting is basically just butterfly lighting, but with a reflector underneath the chin, underneath the face. And that's going to help illuminate and get rid of some of the darkness of the shadows that happen when you have a butterfly lighting positioned high above the subject. So in this particular photo, we had a light source nice and big above our subject and pointing down. That's creating this butterfly effect, slimming down the cheeks on both sides. Got a nice highlight on the nose, highlight on the lower lip, highlight on the chin, highlight on the cheekbones, right? It's doing that. And then when we zoom in and we look at the catch light, we can see that there is that upper light, but there's also a reflector positioned underneath our model here. And that's the reason it's called a clamshell lighting setup, is because it looks kind of like a clam. You've got your upper light creating that butterfly lighting and your lower reflector reflecting some of that light up onto the face and just minimizing the appearance of those shadows. Very common look, very popular for glamour shots, and a really nice flattering look for most people, which is why it's so popular. This is another example of butterfly lighting, only this time we're shooting from the side. So our light is coming and hitting our subject like this, it looks like, just by the fact that we've got the nice illumination of the cheekbones, highlight on the nose here, highlight on the top of the forehead, and then we're shooting into the side of the subject, into the shadow side, the part of the subject that's in shadow. And so when you do that, that's actually called short lighting. And short lighting is very, very popular in cinema, for example. So cinematic lighting is typically short lighting because it tends to just look more dramatic. It adds more drama, more interest, and more mystery to the shot. So if you want to add more of that to your photos, just shoot into the shadow side of the face. So in my case, I've got a light right here. So I would have the camera positioned over here and shoot into the shadow side instead of the lit side. And that will make it look more dramatic, a little bit more mysterious. All right, this photo right here, shabam, let's zoom in here. Now, there's one thing I want to point out that has nothing to do with lighting and everything to do with editing. These eyes have been enhanced a little too much. And the reason you can tell that is because they're just so bright. So if we actually darken down the entire photo here, you'll see that the eyes are just like way too bright. They're glowing even though the rest of her is dark. So just when you're brightening eyes, very effective to do it, but make sure you minimize the amount that's being done. Okay, moving back, we've got our catch lights here. And this lighting setup looks like it was a little more complicated, right? You can see that there was, I'm assuming, a main key light above. And that's because we've got this, there we go. If we zoom in on this eye, we've got a main light source. Looks like just a standard kind of butterfly light right here. And then these lights to the side are either windows or reflectors. I'm gonna assume that there's some kind of reflective material filling in the shadow on either side of the face. And you can tell that because when we look at it, we have hardly any shadows going on, but we still have some nice hot spots that are happening. Hot spots. Sounds like a nice, delicious snack. So what I mean by that is we still have some bright areas and some dark areas. It's not like everything is evenly lit. We still have some drama going on. It's just very soft, very beautiful, very feminine light. So the softer the light is, typically, the more feminine and beautiful it will appear. The harsher the light is, typically, the more masculine and aggressive that light will appear. Here, this photo is just a standard kind of beauty light setup. We've got that butterfly lighting happening. So the light is somewhere over here. A nice big source because it's so soft. You can tell that that light must be quite large. So let's make it even larger. All that just very flattering, very feminine light because it's so soft. On the other hand, we look at this photo, butterfly lighting setup, But unlike our other light, very harsh, very dark shadows under the chin here, very dark shadows underneath the nose. We've got some nice definition and slimming down of the face happening with some shadows on the side here. But you can tell that this harsher light is more masculine. So look at the difference between this lighting setup and this one. The light itself is not that different. We've got two very similar lighting setups, except for one probably has a lot of diffusion, maybe some reflectors happening. The other is just a single light source, much more harsh, much more direct, probably closer to the subject and able to get, in order to get it this bright while having such dark shadows. You can see it's a much more masculine effect by doing so. Again, we've got a very masculine effect. This one, however, is a portrait of a man, but you can see that the light is nowhere near as harsh. It's super, super soft and beautiful. So it feels more feminine than this photo here, which is much more aggressive in the lighting, in the darkness of the shadows. And this is also a great example of Rembrandt lighting. So we've got that nice triangle of illumination right there. So we know that our light was somewhere to the side, coming down like this, having that nice shadow that slims down the nose, slims down the side of the face, but also illuminates that cheekbone just to add some shape. So very harsh light, very hard light tends to be more masculine, very soft light tends to be more feminine. So this light is more feminine and beautiful. Doesn't mean you can only use it on girls, but that's just kind of the effect it will have. It will be more soft, more romantic, just more pleasing to the eye in general and less aggressive. So this one you can see from his glasses, we've got an absolutely huge light off and to the side up here, which is creating some loop lighting for us. No backlight, it doesn't look like, but we do have a background light. And the reason we can tell that there's a background light happening is because you see how on the background itself, there's some slight illumination kind of behind him. So this part of the background is brighter and it gets darker as we go in this direction. Well, that's showing us that there is a light right behind him, probably pointed up at this spot, kind of being the brightest right behind his head. So we get this nice kind of gradient effect. Okay, almost done, then we'll move on to some real life examples. Here's another example of clamshell lighting. We've got butterfly light, and then reflector underneath. Okay, so now that we've looked at some examples of portrait photography setups and how you would actually go about creating beautiful light indoors, let's talk about how we can take that and transfer it over into getting great shots outside. Because most of us don't have a bunch of fancy studio gear and we don't have professional models. We're just going out, we're trying to take amazing photos outside when we're out and about and exploring the world, right? So let's talk about the biggest mistakes people often make when they're shooting outside. The first is shooting at the wrong time of day. Now, outside, in the middle of the day, the sun is generally directly overhead, especially in the summertime. We're going to talk about the winter time in a second here. Now the sun is directly overhead, it's hitting you at a very high angle, and the end effect is going to be the same as if you took a flashlight and you shone it right above you. You're going to get super dark shadows underneath your eyes. You're going to have really harsh lighting, really, really bright spots that are blown out, and really, really dark shadows that are just way too dark. You can see that by looking at this photo here. Our mountains blown out, the roof blown out, areas of the beach blown out, but then you've got really, really dark, nasty shadows underneath this dock. So it's just not a very pleasing effect to our eye. And your camera is not as good as your eye is at taking in a situation. So oftentimes, as a beginner, I would go out, I take photos, and it looks really amazing when I'm there, but then my photo, I would take it, and the photo just doesn't look good. And the reason is because your photo is like a really, really crappy version of your eye. So your eye has a certain amount of latitude. It can take in a certain amount of brightness and darkness and make it all look good. Your camera is much more limited, and that's called the amount of stops that it can actually capture. It's basically the dynamic range of that camera. Different cameras have better or worse dynamic range, but they're all limited compared to your eye, which is why we need to be really careful with the time of day we shoot. And the reason is, if we wait until later in the day or we shoot earlier in the day, the angle of the sun in the sky changes. So obviously when the sun is setting over these mountains, and it's a beautiful sunset, I should probably make this available as a print later. The sun is actually no longer coming from straight down, it's now coming from the side. And so it's going to change both the appearance of the shadows as they hit your face. As the sun hits your face, the shadows will be different, so we can get some Rembrandt style lighting or some loop lighting or even some butterfly lighting rather than just raccoon eye lighting. But it's also going to be going through more atmosphere. So the sun is taking this long to reach you instead of taking just this long to reach you. And so it's going through all of those little tiny microscopic droplets of water vapor that make up the atmosphere, and it's slowly being diffused. It's creating a more soft light source. That's why on cloudy days, you have much softer light. Everything in the scene, this is the exact same place, but everything is much more saturated. The dark parts of the image are not as dark, and the bright parts are not as bright, which gives your camera a better chance of capturing everything in that image. It can use that dynamic range it has, and it won't be blown out. Now, if we look at an example of our Earth here, this is going to make it make a lot more sense. We've got our sunshine happening here. Let's say this is the middle of the day. The sun goes through this much atmosphere to get to you, and then you take a photo, and it's lovely, and everybody cheers, okay? Now, if we wait until sunset, the sun is now no longer directly above you shining down. It's right here, just on the crest of the Earth, and instead of going through this much atmosphere, it's now going to be going to reach you. So it's going through all of this atmosphere up here in space. It's being diffused. It's nature's largest softbox, and it's going to make really beautiful, pleasing effects. That's why sunset or sunrise, best time of day to shoot. Middle of the afternoon, worst time of day to shoot, because you have less actual diffusion happening, okay? Now, the other thing to be aware of is the time of year. So, part of the reason that photos look so good in the fall is because obviously the colors of the leaves have changed and whatnot. But even during the middle of the day, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the angle of the sun in the wintertime actually changes. So in the middle of the summer, the sun might be hitting the Earth directly, okay? And that's at, say, 12 o'clock. However, in the wintertime, because it gets darker earlier, it gets brighter later and darker earlier, the sun actually never gets to this full point above the horizon. It might start here, and it'll go to here. And then it'll go back, and the sun sets again. So now, the sun is pretty much in sunset mode the entire day. Even in the middle of the day, you've still got nice flattering light. And that's part of the reason it's so much better taking photos outdoors in the fall, is because the sun is going to be lower in the sky, it's going through more diffusion, more atmosphere, it's making the light much more flattering. That's another reason that when you go to a tropical country that is located on the equator, the sun tends to be much more direct above you most of the day and most of the year. You don't have as harsh seasons or as wide changes in seasons, and so the wide change in the sun's angle doesn't happen so much. In the summertime, in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, the further away from the equator you go, the more direct the light is going to be all day during the summer, and the more kind of diffused it's going to be all winter and fall and spring. So that's why shooting at different times of day matters, and specifically why shooting at different seasons in the year makes a big difference as well. It's not just the colors of the trees in the fall, it's also the actual direction of the light and the quality of that light. Okay, now one other thing to note is that when sun is hitting your scene in a photo like this on a sunny day, it's actually reflecting off of all these objects. So it's not coming directly to your camera, it's hitting this mountain, and then it's hitting you. And it's hitting these trees, and then it's hitting you. Or it's hitting this water and it's coming up and it's reflecting into your camera. Now, the reason that this matters is as the sun enters this water, some of that light is going to be absorbed by the water. And then some of it is going to be reflected towards you. And the reason that that water is blue and the sky is blue is because that's the part of the light that is not being absorbed by the atmosphere and is being reflected from the water. Likewise, the reason that trees are green and plants are green is because they absorb primarily the other spectrums of light. They primarily absorb the reds and the blues and the yellows and whatnot, everything except for green, which is why the rest of that light, the green light, gets reflected to your eye, and then the tree appears green. Now, this might be too sciencey, but the reason it matters is because when you have too much light, so when you have this much light in the middle of the day, a certain amount of light, even if it's just yellow light or red light or blue light, basically white light, which is a combination of all the different colors of light, is going to hit this tree, and instead of being absorbed, it's actually just going to be reflected because there's just too much to be absorbed, and so that tree is now going to appear more white or less saturated than it would if there was a darker sky above. There's less light now hitting these trees, and so because there's less light, both directionally hitting the trees, but also just in general hitting the trees, everything is darker on a cloudy day, well then more of that white light is going to be absorbed by the tree, and then we get a more pure green color reflected into our camera. So that's another reason that sunset / cloudy days makes a big difference to the actual colors in our photo, is because on a brighter day, you've got more just white light reflecting to your camera. Everything looks more washed out. Everything looks more yucky and has less color and less contrast between different things in terms of color saturation. Because it's so bright, we've got more white light reflecting into our camera. Now, I hope that made sense. It's really bugged me for a long time why I didn't understand how that worked. So that's me giving you the gist of it. If you want to look into it more, feel free. But now you know, if it's a very bright day, you want to avoid shooting during the middle of the afternoon wherever possible, because you're going to get really just washed out, yucky, not so good colors. It's going to have too much dynamic range, and the angle of the sun is going to both give you yucky shadows, and it's going to be less diffused and just give you less flattering light in general, okay? So that's shooting outdoors. All of these photos here were taken of the same place at the same time of day. Let's talk about the different lighting situations and why the colors are so different. So we kind of covered this already. This was in the middle of the day. Sun, very direct, very gross. This taken during a cloudy, rainy day. And the lower the clouds are, the more diffused that light is going to be. And that's because the sun is going through more layers of diffusion. That cloud layer is thicker, and so you wind up with these really beautiful saturated colors and a nice contrasted photo that isn't over contrasty. It's not blowing things out, and we're not losing shadows, okay? So now let's look at this photo, which was actually a high overcast day. Now, the difference in color is staggering, right? This one is really beautiful, really kind of amazing, whereas this photo right here just feels lackluster. There's something missing. There's no life to it. That's because we've got this high overcast situation going on, which is partially diffusing the sun, but it's also still the middle of the day, so we don't have enough diffusion going on to really give us those beautiful saturated colors. We've kind of got a mixture of this blown out kind of saturationless sky, but without any of the interest of the sun. Without the blue sky, things look even more dead. So the worst time of day to shoot, and the worst conditions to shoot, for me at least, is really high cloud days. If it's low cloud, the colors tend to be amazing. It's super easy to get exposure. You can shoot in any direction you want. But high cloud days, very tricky, because it's hard to tell even what direction the sun's coming from, but it still looks harsh. You can still get really harsh shadows underneath the eyes. Things look gross in general. So if you have this kind of condition outside, my advice would be either to shoot in what would normally be the shade in the sun, or to wait until later in the day or shoot earlier in the day, because this is probably my least favorite time to take photos. It just doesn't tend to look good. Things are still harsh, but they're also not as kind of vibrant and happy as a sunny day. Now, we've got a sunny day happening here. This probably was, middle of the summer. It's hard to say what time of year, but we have the sun coming in this direction and hitting our wedding party straight on. Now you can see that we've got really, really harsh, really defined shadows happening here. They're really dark under the eyes. Everybody is squinting. We've got a blown out dress going on, really bright highlights, and things just look gross and kind of washed out, too contrasty. It's not nice. Now, what do you do if you're in a situation like this? It's a live event and you can't do anything about what time of day you're shooting. Well, the first thing to do is to control the angle that you're shooting. So you see this fence here. This fence actually tells us exactly where the sun is positioned, because we've got the shadow of the fence and the fence itself. So if we line these two up, the angle of the sun is something like this. So the sun was hitting our wedding party like this, and slightly, from the front. Now, if we had changed this wedding party and moved them so that they were backlit instead of side lit, we would have had a nice ring around all of them. It would have been a really kind of beautiful scene, and we would have still had this nice background going on. We still would have had the lodge and the mountains in the background. So if we had simply pivoted the wedding party so that they were facing this way instead of this way, we would have had much better lighting conditions. That's my go-to if I'm stuck outside middle of the day and I can't control what time it is, which is pretty typical of a wedding. I will make the couple face away from the sun, because once they're backlit, I can control the amount of shade on their face. I can just brighten that up later. But if they're side lit like this and part of them is super bright and part of them is super dark, there's not much you can do about that when you're editing. It's going to look pretty gross. Okay. Now, again, if it was a different time of year, this angle might have actually been quite a bit lower. The sun would have been more diffused, and you also would have wound up just having more options, but not much you can do about the time of year for a wedding. Okay. Now, this is another example. This photo looks really bad because for some reason it's not the full res version. Let's just pretend it was high res. This photo here was taken on a kind of cloudy day, kind of sunny day, but we have a very blown out lodge in the background here, and our couple just looks too bright. Now, it's hard to really tell because this photo is so low resolution, but if we zoom out here to maybe 1, 2, that's not going to work. 1 to 1. Here we go. Okay, there's 1 to 1. You can tell that the couple is just too bright for the scene because we look at the shadows, and you can just feel that something is off. That's because they've got a flash on them. And the problem with flash, when you don't match it up properly, is you need to make sure that the flash itself is coming at the same angle as the sun. So the sun in this photo looks like it was actually coming down around like this, whereas the flash was hitting our couple like this. And that's why it feels off. So if you're using flash or artificial light outdoors, make sure that it actually matches up with the natural environment, or it'll just look kind of cheesy to your eye. Okay, here's another one taken at sunset. So you can see the massive difference that you have once you have that atmosphere. You can even see how the background is no longer as clear. That's because we've got the atmosphere being illuminated by the sun's rays around sunset. We've got a nice kind of backlit feel going on. It's nice, golden, beautiful, really nice saturated colors. So you don't have to shoot when it's cloudy. You can shoot during sunny days, but definitely shoot around sunset when you can. So in summary, when you're shooting outdoors, whenever possible, you want to shoot earlier in the day or later in the day when the sun is lower in the sky, or choose conditions that are just more conducive to better photos. So if you have an overcast day and it's a nice low cloud, take advantage of that. That's gonna make the biggest difference by far. Now, the other thing to be aware of too is if you're outdoors and it's a sunny day, there's nothing you can do about the fact that it's sunny and you have to take these photos right now, you can't wait till later. Well, then do your very best to position your subject away from the sun so that you are facing the sun and they are nice and backlit. You've got nice shade on them. So here's some examples from the world's most subpar model that I took the other day. So we are not grading the quality of these photos. They were all taken around high noon when the light was the very worst possible. Now this is an example of direct sun. So we've got me illuminated by the sun, facing directly into the sun. So you can see really harsh shadows under my eyes. I'm squinting because it's very, very bright. Just doesn't look good. The colors are nice and washed out, so nothing is good about this. Now we're slightly better here because the sun is coming from the side. So we have much better colors in our grass. We're not getting quite as blown out in terms of saturation. We're also getting maybe a little bit more of an interesting lighting situation because we're sort of side lit, but still not really good. We're kind of blowing out the side of my face. Now, this is me facing away from the sun, camera's facing towards the sun. Okay, now this is my go-to. If I can't control where I go, I will just angle my client, my model, so that they are facing away from the sun, I'm facing towards the sun. And if possible, I will try and get a nice dark background behind them. That's going to help separate them. And also, I'll be able to brighten the photo up later. So let's just add some exposure, so I can brighten it up without worrying about blowing out the background. So if you can find a nice dark background, try to do that. Now, this is the last and most preferable situation. You're able to actually move right up and closer to that background so we don't have anything blown out in our scene. So we've got really nice controlled lighting conditions, and you can see how much softer the light is compared to direct. Here's direct, here's from the side, here is away from the sun, and here's away from the sun, but in the shade. Now, the very last thing that I will try to do if possible, get your subject to step forward a step or two once you actually position them in the shade. And what that's going to do is just eventually the sun will just start to kiss the back of their hair and their shoulders, and you'll get a nice separation from the background, a little bit of backlight. So if we flip between this photo and this photo, you can see that in this one right here, we've got just a little bit of sunshine on the top of my head, on my hair, and on my shoulders. So we don't want this much because that's going to blow out my shoulders. There's just too much light hitting there. But if we step backwards, so we're just in the right spot, we're gonna get a nice glowing backlight effect without blowing anything out. So that's just a little trick that I like to use. It makes it a lot more interesting. The photo's a lot better. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about when it comes to shooting outdoors that most people just don't think about is the color cast from different reflections around your scene. So for example, if we look at these 4 photos and we flip between them, you can see that the colors kind of vary a little bit when you look at my skin tone. So in this photo, my skin is kind of a nice warm peach, let's call it. Whereas if we go to this photo, my skin is much bluer, much darker, and kind of even a little bit green. Now, the reason for that is the light that's hitting the scene and reflecting up into my face. So in this scene, I'm standing on this porch deck type thing. The light is hitting the deck, it's hitting the grass, it's hitting this umbrella, it's hitting everything in the scene, and all of that is reflecting onto my face, combined with the direct light from the sun. Now, because this deck has kind of reddish stones, that's why everything looks kind of pink. My skin tone is more pink than usual. Whereas this photo, taken in the middle of this field, we're going to have a lot of reflections from the grass coming up and hitting my body. So if we actually zoom in here on these shadows, you can see that there's kind of a green cast going on in the shadow areas where the sun isn't directly hitting me and it's just the reflections. We've got a very kind of green cast going on. Whereas when we go to the shadows, the shadow option, shooting here in the dark, we're going to have a lot more reflected light, a lot less directional light, and so we're going to have even more of a greenish kind of blue cast. So you do want to be aware of that as you're actually setting up for taking photos, because you can't always correct that with just white balance. Sure, we could take our white balance and we could warm it up. like so. Warm it to maybe around there, and then maybe add a little bit of magenta to try and counteract that green tone. But all light is not created equal, so sometimes you'll get into a situation where you can't actually correct it. It still looks wrong. By the time your skin looks right, the trees look really strange, or by the time the trees look right, your skin looks strange. So you want to have as nice light to begin with as you can, so when possible, I recommend avoiding situations like this. So certain greens are different from other greens, right? You can see with your eyes, some of them are more of a greenish yellow, and some of them are going to be more like our Banff forest here with a very dark green. These dark greens tend to be much more flattering in terms of the colors that you get when you're shooting in this kind of an area, whereas these kind of greens, because we've got much more translucent leaves, I guess, tend to just give way more of a green cast to your photos. Whereas if we actually take this same scene and we take a picture of it in the middle of the fall, yeah, the sun's angle is different, but mostly the color of the leaves is different, and so it's going to reflect off of these leaves, and the light that we get is going to be much more orange, which is going to be much more pleasing and natural for your skin tones. You're no longer going to have that really awful, disgusting color cast. So be aware of that all of the light in your scene is reflecting off everything in your scene. And so if you have a bunch of green grass underneath you and some green trees overhead, you're going to have a green cast on the skin. You just need to plan around that. So if possible, I try whenever I can to avoid shooting in places like this. I want to find nicer, darker greens, and that will give me a better kind of end result. So you can see the difference in the quality of greens between this and the color of the greens in the grass. This is much more saturated and ugly. These greens are more of a pastel, so they're going to give you better results overall. Okay, so at this point, you have a basic foundational understanding of good lighting. What makes for good light? Well, there's hard light, there's soft light, there's the different angle that you employ, there's the different lighting techniques for different styles of portraits, and then there's the foundational principles for what time of day to shoot and why that makes a difference, and how clouds affect the light in your scene, how different colors reflecting off of your background affect your scene, all those good things. But how do we take those technical details and actually merge them together with the creative? How do you improve your photography through lighting and support the emotional feel of your photo? Well, I think the best way to do that is to look at cinema, because movies are all about triggering emotion. And if you can figure out how to use your lighting to support the emotion in your photo, you're going to improve your photography. So let's head over here and just look at a couple examples. We're going to look at some rom-coms to start with. And what I want you to notice is just how soft the light tends to be in romantic comedies. Overall, it's very soft, very flattering light. And that's because it kind of has a more romantic, more beautiful feel. And generally, the more romantic the movie, like if you watch Pride and Prejudice, it is so soft, so little contrast, and absolutely beautiful and stunning. And that just supports the main feeling of the movie, which is beauty and romance and all that good stuff. Whereas if you have a higher drama scene, typically you'll have higher contrast lighting that will support the emotion that's going on in your scene. So obviously, this particular scene, a bit of a high, intense, emotional moment, we're going to have more intentional, intense light. Okay, watching a few more of these, you're going to see, again, very soft, very beautiful light. You can even go ahead, just find your favorite movie and pause it with the sound off and say, okay, where did they light this scene from? Where do I think the scene was being lit from? What different effects were being used? How is color being used in the scene to trigger emotion? And that's one thing we haven't really talked about that we'll talk in a future video, is the use of color, because color is a part of light. But how do we use color in our scene to convey emotion as well? Because that can be an extremely effective tool in adding depth and emotion to your photos. So that's romantic comedies. They tend to be very soft, very flattering, very beautiful. Whereas if we look at photos like this, photos, movies. Okay, in this example, we have our scene, very dramatic, huge fight scene happening. So we've got a lot of contrast, a lot of shadow, and you're going to notice, because it's an action movie, we've got short lighting happening. Another interesting thing that you'll notice about action movies in particular, but all sorts of cinematic lighting, is it tends to have a lot more color involved than typical photography. When you take a photo of a person, most of the time you're going to have very just flat white light on them. Whereas in movies, the more cinematic lighting tends to make much more use of color. So you can see that our key lights are actually blue and green instead of having a white light on them. And everything about the cinematography is supporting the emotion of the scene. So we've got very fast cuts, very jumpy frames. We've got really harsh, contrasty lighting. And all of that is just serving to support the emotion going on in the scene. Now, another way to really improve your ability to intentionally use light is just to look at other examples from other photographers and really dissect it. Be intentional. Don't just say, this photo is cool or this photo makes me feel good. Say, okay, what is the emotion of this photo and how is the photographer supporting that emotion? So if we look up in Unsplash, something like happy, we look through these photos. and we just look for the lighting. Okay, happy lighting tends to be very, very bright, right? It's high contrast, high saturation, lots of color in your life. Backlit, obviously we've got the expression, but if we're just talking about lighting, what lighting is happy? Now, whereas if we were to put something like sadness, very different lighting being employed, right? You don't have sadness photos being taken on a blue and sunny day. Whereas this one, which was for some reason tagged as sadness, to me does not feel sad. Why doesn't this photo feel sad? Because we've got a bright blue sunny sky and bright blue sparkly ocean on a bright blue day, or a lake, whatever it is. You understand? Whereas this photo to me, much more sad. Cloudy day, rainy day, no color, sadness, right? So the colors you employ, the lighting techniques you use are going to aid or take away from the emotion of your photo. So just be intentional about that. Go through and watch movies that you absolutely love, but do it with the sound off so you're not super engaged and lost in the plot, and say to yourself, okay, how does this scene that I so love, how does this actually support through lighting and through color the emotion that's going on and that the actors are acting out, right? And that will majorly improve your photos and help you just merge the technical understanding of lighting and how all of it works and how you can take that and transfer it over into the creative aspect. Now, the next step obviously is going to be going out and doing this for yourself. So I challenge you, if you've got some time, go out, spend an afternoon, just go for a walk and say, okay, I want to take a photo that is happy. I want to take a photo that is sad. I want to take a photo that is resigned. I want to take a photo that is introspective, right? You can put these different emotions down and say, how can I do that? Go out, find lighting that you think supports that, and take photos and share them. I'd love it if you would do that and tag me at SignatureEditsCo on Instagram so I can see your work. If this video has been helpful, do me a huge favor. Would you hit that like button for me and subscribe if you want to see more content like this? Hit the notification bell so you stay up to date when I actually put out new videos, and I will see you in the next video. But please leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought. Hit that like button, and in the meantime, go create something awesome. Take care.
Okay.